Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be, NNPA. This is Charles W. Cherry, the second publisher of both the Florida Courier newspaper and the Daytona Times newspaper, coming to you from my living room in sunny South Florida. Unfortunately, I can't be with you live for this year's convention. I am co-hosting a family reunion that was planned well before we set up the convention, but I know that our good friends in Seattle, particularly Bernie Foster and the Scanner Group folks, are putting on a great convention. I wish I could be there with you. I'm sitting here in my living room just trying to give you some thoughts on the topic for discussion. I want to thank my good brother, Brother Richard Muhammad, for allowing me to appear via technology as compared to not being able to give you my thoughts on the topic that he has put together. And of course, what's up to my good friends over at the Final Call. He wanted me, Richard has wanted me to sort of weigh in from the perspective of our coverage of the Trayvon Martin trial. The Florida Courier is a statewide newspaper. We distribute 90,000 newspapers, and that's CVC audited on a weekly basis. We go to Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, Tampa, St. Petersburg, Jacksonville, and the Daytona Times is our Daytona Beach newspaper. Trayvon Martin was killed about 40 miles from Daytona Beach, and so we took a real interest in that story from the beginning. But I want to tell you how we got started. I was over in Africa about the time that a little actually after Trayvon was killed. His attorney, the family attorneys, who are Darryl Parks and Ben Crump, are friends of mine. I got a call from Ben Crump actually while I was over in Africa, who told me that they were unable to get much traction on the Trayvon story, and he gave me sort of the background. I said, well, here's what I'll do, Ben. I'll get my reporters on it right away. And the week that I was still in Africa, we broke that story in the Florida Courier. Now we can't make a claim of ownership. He had also, of course, contacted other folks on the journalism side, not just here, but other black journalists for some of the other newspaper and online outlets. But there was sort of a mass of folks who basically, even though we were not working together, that we all had contact with Ben Crump and the Parks Law Firm to try to move this thing forward. The original rallies were sort of grassroots. The Daytona Times took an interest in those rallies basically because they were organized by pastors from Daytona who brought in Reverend Jackson and Reverend Sharpton. You had 40,000 people there. We sent reporters down there to take pictures with their phones, to do live tweeting and Facebook posts from the rallies, and sort of went forward from there. I think, though, there were some missed opportunities. George Curry, God bless his heart, called me after the verdict and complimented my staff and myself for what we did. But in my heart of hearts, I knew we could have done a lot better than we actually did in terms of covering that story. But I want to speak so from my perspective as a publisher, as well as from what I think NNPA should have been able to do to make that story the kind of international. And the first good thing I think was that we should probably have committed to own that story nationally, and we very well could have. The reason why we could have owned that story is because we actually had a seat at the trial. I'm an attorney, 30 years. I'm a former Florida State prosecutor. When I first heard, and when I got back from Africa and saw that this was probably going to be a trial, it was not going to be a plea, I contacted the Sanford court administrator's office, told her who I was, and told her we wanted a seat. And at that point, we were only the third media outlet to ask for a seat. The only other people that had seats at that point in time were the New York Times and Newsweek. So the Florida Courier could have been there, and had the Florida Courier been there, then of course the NNPA would have been there. But as time went on, it was clear that we did not have the repertorial or the financial resources that it was going to take, because ideally what we would have done was to send somebody there to cover this thing from start to stop, which is from pretrial motions, for bond motions, for motions to dismiss, for motions to strike pleadings, and all these other kinds of motions that go on. But it was clear as I saw the trial developing that we could not do that. So we sort of picked our spots, and had we had the resources, and had NNPA had the resources or decided to provide those resources, we should have had somebody there. Ideally, I would have had a person there who was an experienced converged or backpack journalist, somebody and somebody who was either a lawyer, not necessarily a lawyer, but had legal experience, particularly with regard to what goes on in criminal trials. That person could have tweeted live for all the hearings, could have posted to Facebook, could have done video stand-ups outside the courthouse, and I think that would have given us an opportunity also to link up with video outlets such as TV1 and BET with a reporter who would have been branded with NNPA. Additionally, there were some sidebar stories that we wrote some of them. We looked at the preachers who were involved. We wrote some articles on that. There was Rachel Gentile, who folks were very much interested in. There were sidebar stories on Parks and Crump and the black law firm and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of. Additionally, there were stories that we did write in the Florida Courier, dealing with the issue of police brutality in Sanford. Sanford has a substantial black population. They had a black city official. There had always been 40 or 50 years of really disgruntlement, to use sort of a mild term, in terms of the relationship between the black Sanford community and the Sanford leadership. So there were a lot of stories that we did some. We could have done a lot better. So I think that we really missed as an organization, both from the Florida Courier side, to brand ourselves as better than we are already branded as a statewide organization of some journalistic clout. And I think that NNPA missed also a way for us to begin to brand ourselves in what really became an international story, and for us to be sort of the go-to folks to tell those stories from an unapologetically black perspective. So based on that kind of experience, what are some of the recommendations? I'm going to give you 7. I'm going to make them quick. 7, as you church folks know, is a significant number. So I'm going to hit my 7 points, and then I'm going to turn it over to Brother Richard, and hopefully it will benefit the conversation going forward. 1, I think NNPA has to make an organizational commitment to consistent, high-level investigative journalism. We don't have that as an organizational commitment. We have begun to just hawk ads. It was the journalism that built this organization. It was the journalism, essentially, and the investigative journalism that folks like Ida B. Wells, Barnett, and other folks did to make sure that people knew what was happening with the black community. Particularly, you talk about the anti-lynching campaign. That's what it was. That was investigative journalism. We have to get back to that. We have to be willing to go where nobody else is going on a lot of these stories. Number 2, we have to commit the resources necessary for NNPA to produce such consistent, high-level investigative journalism. Now, we know that resources is just a synonym for money. We got to put some money into investigative journalism that is going to be branded by NNPA. Number 3, we need to take advantage of the downsizing of daily newspaper newsrooms. There's a lot of black qualified talent that have been downsized, and downsizers is a pseudonym for fired. They've been fired. They're doing blog sites. They're working for free. Some of them wouldn't have had taken the time of day to talk to a black newspaper publisher 5, 10, 15 years ago. But those times have changed. So we got black reporters out there that can tell the story, but they got to be paid to do it. So we have to be willing to pay, to sit down with them, to talk to them about the community of interest. You got a story to tell. You got the skill to get that story out there. We have the ability to put the story out there because we got the websites, we've got the newspapers. And so if you want to tell a story, come talk to us about it. Number 4, we got to start using the unique content we already produce in our newspapers on black, and I'm reading notes here so I can stay focused. So, use the unique content that we produce already and start using that on blackpress.org. we have so much stuff that's going on. We got almost 200 newspapers. Everybody doesn't have a website, but what we should be doing is, we talked about this when I was on the board, is to scrape those stories, that unique content that we're putting up every week on our websites, and those should be highlighted on our blackpress.org website, because it's content that nobody else has generated. We already have it. We have access to it. So we should be putting the content that we are already own as NNPA publishers, and putting it out there for everybody to see. And I think that will help us in terms of the traffic that we need to develop, so that once again NNPA becomes the go-to source for information anywhere in the world, actually, about black folks in America and black folks throughout the African diaspora. Number 5, we got to start pooling local and state repertorial resources, but with NNPA support. I would suggest that the board put some money in a budget, and then for those of us who have these kinds of stories, we shouldn't have to be responsible for taking the complete burden of telling those stories that have national significance. So that's something that the board again has to do with regard to trying to make the commitment that's necessary. Commitment means making a financial commitment to do the things that we need to do to move forward on the journalistic side. Number 6, we need to encourage stories. We would encourage our publishers to identify stories of national significance. If you had Florida, this is something like this Trayvon situation is going to happen again in Florida, because Florida is part of the epicenter of dysfunction in America. From a criminal perspective, from a fraud perspective, most of these things start in Florida. There's going to be another Trayvon. As you all know, there was something similar that happened where this kid got shot in Jacksonville by a guy who thought that they would the music. He was parked next to these kids, had booming music, got into a dispute, pulled out a gun and shot this kid dead. And so those things are going to happen. We, I think, as publishers, have to keep our eyes open, our ears close to the ground, and when those kind of stories happen. But we need to have somebody that we can call, whether it's George Curry or somebody from the journalistic side, to say there's a hot story. Let's sit down and talk about how we can cover it, and then there should be some budget associated with it, where we can hire our own reporters and subsidize them reporting that from our own papers, or to bring somebody in from an investigative journalism team that's going to do what's necessary to get the story up on the webs and in our newspapers. Finally, number 7, folks, we got to start thinking digitally. Digital. We've got to start thinking digital. We're being left behind from a news gathering perspective. We have other folks who are essentially trying to cover the field of black journalism because they're online and out, but we do not necessarily think instinctively digitally, because we've been in hard copies of newspapers for so long. I see the digital and the technology, just like what I'm using now to be able to communicate with you while I got something else to do, as being a small business equalizer. We can equalize the power that we have as NNPA against any other news gathering organization, whether it be the Root or the Griot or anybody else that has the large corporate funding, Wall Street funding, and calling themselves a black news gathering organization. We can put them out of their misery if we begin to think digitally, as well as continue to operate our analog or our hard copies of our newspapers. So that's what I have. I thank you, Richard. I know I ran it 2 or 3 minutes over. Please credit that to my heart, not to my head. Hope that the time that you spent was not robbery. God bless you. God bless NNPA.